Hello students, in the previous classes we have seen the life and history of William Shakespeare, comedies, tragedies, historical plays, and the usage of soliloquies, usage of supernatural events. All these things in the previous classes we have seen, and in this video we are going to see about the fools in Shakespearean plays and women in Shakespearean plays. First, let us see the fools in Shakespearean plays. The fool or the clown or the jester are practically synonymous terms in Shakespeare's plays because we find that these terms are being employed for the same purpose, namely to offer food for laughter to the audience. During the Elizabethan period, the kings, the noblemen, and other wealthy persons used to employ fools in order to entertain themselves and their friends either on certain ceremonial occasions or in the common parlor. The fool or the clown or the jester used to wear a part-colored dress and also a conical cap and carry in his head a staff with some jingling bells attached to one end of it, which the fool used to shake before his listeners whenever he sent to speak something foolish or funny in order to excite laughter in them. The fool was most privileged in the sense that he used to be permitted to speak any amount of sense and nonsense before any august assembly and sparing none of the august persons for his jokes, which were sometimes humorous, sometimes witty, sometimes farcical, and vulgar also, and vulgar. He had also the movements of his body, some kind of gesture which also was intended to excite laughter. The fools in Shakespeare is introduced to comedies as well as into tragedies, historical plays as well as romance. The main purpose of such an appearance of the fool in certain scenes is to relieve the tragic tension or even to intensify the tragic tension by lending a grim, sarcastic tone to his humor or fooleries. Sometimes the function of the fool is to moralize or sermonize or philosophize over certain situations and incidents of the play or even upon the actions of certain characters, mostly the actions of the hero or the heroine of the play, or sometimes his functions is to give the connecting links between the scenes or the acts of the play. While at other times his function is to explain certain things, either the behavior of the hero or the heroine or the trend of the action of play, which would otherwise remain unintelligible to the audience. Hence, the fool is not merely a humorist but a philosopher and a critic. He is not always necessarily a fool or an imbectic or half-witted fellow, but on the other hand, he is one of the wisest or the most learned character in the whole play. It is through the lips of the fool that sometimes Shakespeare speaks and expresses his own opinion on certain matters. Most of the fools in Shakespeare are the wisest persons, in spite of their pretensions of stupidity or imbecility. The most remarkable fool in Shakespeare's plays is the fool in King Lear. He possesses considerable wit. He speaks many outrageous things, and yet Lear does not take any offense. For example, he reminds Lear of the ingratitude of his daughter when Lear is himself smarting under the very same wound. That's why in no other play of Shakespeare the fool contributes so much of pathos as the fool in King Lear. Although sharp, sarcastic and also witty at the same time, all the qualities of a jester and a satirist are combined in Lear's fool. This fool's words add to the tragic tension of the storm scene in the play instead of softening this atmosphere which is produced by the ingratitude of the daughters on the one hand and by the fury of nature in the form of storm out of doors, which is in perfect sympathy with the storm in Lear's heart. It is most pathetic when Lear remarks about his fool. That particular line is, "Poor fool and knave, I have one part in my heart that's sorry yet for these." This is the lines in the text. I have taken these lines in the text. We do not know in what manner the fool in Lear dies, but we know that he surely dies because he could never survive his master to whom he was much devoted, as the master was also equally devoted to him. The fool's death is typical of the unbalanced mind of a fool whose thoughts are concentrated upon one person, one thing and one mission in life, and who therefore cannot or doesn't like to survive the person for whom alone to lives. According to certain critics, Touchstone stands second among the fools of Shakespeare, probably because he talks more like a learned and wise person than as a fool. Of course, he represents the tribe of the conventional domestic jesters who wear a party-colored garment, a fool's cap, and also who carry a staff with jingling bells attached to one end and philosophical, and that is why we find him speaking not sense and nonsense, nor even in season and out of season, but he chooses his topic or subjects of his talk quite prudently and suitable to the occasion. Unlike the conventional fool, he does not play upon words. Rather, he hates punning because he considers such methods exciting laughter in the audience as foolish. He believes more in appealing to the philosophical mind of his listeners. Like Fest of Twelfth Night, he is not a corrupter of words because he believes more in logical or argumentative remarks which can appeal only to the intellect or the thinking power of his audience. Mark what Jacques says about him. Is not this a rare fellow? He is as good as anything and yet a fool. One chief peculiarity of Touchstone's humor is that it is never malicious because his aim is not to wound anybody's feelings, and he utters a good deal of truths which we cannot expect from the lips of the ordinary fool or even from the average wise man. He is devoted to the exiled duke, and that is why he follows him in his exile. That is why we say that Touchstone is not an ordinary fool. Fest of 12th night also belongs to the group of domestic fools. Having served Olivia's father, his jesting is professional foolery rather than spontaneous humor. He strikes one as a man of intellect and character who perhaps found his work uncongenial. He entertains as much by his singing as his clowning, for he is an accomplished musician and entrusted with the delightful songs of the play. Obviously, he is a man of some education, for he shows himself familiar with Greek history and knows something of the Pythagorean philosophy. He is freely admitted to the revels of Sir Andrew Aguecheek and Sir Toby Belch, and is a special favorite with everyone on account of his mellifluous voice. Malvolio alone hated Fest, and although Olivia rebuked the steward for dispersing the fool, she afterwards turned round and said, "Now you see, sir, how your fooling grows old and people dislike it." The discussion that has arisen over the song, which brings the play to a close in an illuminating comment on the general estimate of Fest's character. Some regard the ditty as a kind of history of life which could only be entrusted to a singer of intelligence. Others, however, dismiss it as an improvised jig such as were common in Elizabethan households. Trinculo in The Tempest. Trinculo is the fool in The Tempest, is a mean type of Shakespearean fools because he lacks decent humor or intelligent wit, because he indulges mostly in plays upon words or in vulgar, which is nothing but buffoonery, and because on the top of all he is a damned coward. And he is a damned coward, and and we confirmed addict to drink. He is confirmed to addict to drinking. Even Caliban, a monster, hates Trinculo and outwits him. The only one remark which Trinculo makes and which is worth noting is, misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. What is it? Misery acquaints man with strange bedfellows. It's a textual line. Trinculo is really one of the most degenerate forms of the Elizabethan fools. There are other fools or clowns in Shakespeare's plays, but they are not as remarkable as the fools we have just criticized or analyzed, and yet some of them are maintainable. These are Launcelot Gobbo, in Merchant of Venice. Who is it? Lancelot Gobbo in Merchant of Venice. Co-starred in Love's Labour's Lost. Who is it? Co-starred in Love's Labour's Lost. The son of the old shepherd in The Winter's Tale. The grave diggers in Hamlet. The clown in All Wills That Ends Well. And the jesters who appear in Othello and Timon of Athens. That's it. Shakespeare's fools should be classified according to the various types of humor which Shakespeare uses in his plays. We have seen that in most of the comedies, Shakespeare uses either witty humor or farcical humors, grim humor or ironic humor or philosophical humor or romantic humor. Bantering or biting humor, pungent humor or refreshing humor. These are all the humors handled by Shakespeare in a very beautiful way. The variety of the fools in Shakespeare's plays indicate an observation of the various types of persons who are capable of expressing their humorous spirit in their own typical ways, which can be clarified, distinguished from one another. We can surely distinguish Falstaff from Touchstone, or Fest from the Fool in King Lear, Lancelot Gobbo from Trinculo, and the Gravedigger from all other clown fools in Shakespearean plays. We can distinguish each and every fools in Shakespearean plays. That is the handling of Shakespeare in the fools in his plays. This is about the fools handling, how Shakespeare handles the fools in his plays. Next we pass on to the women in Shakespeare's plays. How he handled the women characters. Shakespeare has no heroes, he has only heroines. Shakespeare's women are more remarkable than his men. Even Marlowe, who paved the way for Shakespeare, and no natural conception of womanhood. His women are mostly distorted visions of youthful fancy and are therefore in the form of exaggerated virtues, and they have prototype in reality. They have no prototype in reality. The Elizabethan mind was particularly imbued with every weakness of women. The court life of England had the weakness of idealizing women in every form, women's form and beauty, her speech and action, her thought and manners, her virtues, and even her vices were pitched too high in the eyes of the new Renaissance priests. And therefore, every woman was painted a demigod. Nobody considered that woman, also like man, is a creature with frailties, freaks and fancies, with individually and a personal stamp of her own. Just as men cannot simply be either gods or devils, but form various types, as women also must form a variety with every point or difference and similarity. It was the Shakespeare who discovered the real mystery of women's nature, caught her in very flesh and blood, and viewed her total personality is in the light of earthly perfection and worldly limitation. Every woman in Shakespeare is so natural that she forms a single character. A distinct individual, unique by herself, and although she resembles other women only in the elements of general human character, yet she has got her own heart, her own tongue, her own soul, and even her own limbs. Pope has justly remarked as every single character in Shakespeare is as much. What is it? Every single character in Shakespeare is as much an individual as those in life itself. It is as impossible to find any two alike. Had all the speeches have been printed without the very names of the persons, I believe one might have applied them with certainty to every speaker. This was told by Pope. Of course, Pope goes too far in this creed of difference and describes to Shakespeare too much subtlety and distinction, which might lead to some amount of unnaturalness and also to impossibility of generalization. It is not safe to generalize on human character because it is so full of variety, change, distinction, strange and unique touches. Yet we can generalize only with the limitations of the character of Shakespeare's plays. We believe Shakespeare's women are not impatient of more words, although Raleigh, one of the critics, Raleigh quotes the case of Imogen, who feels tortured by the attentions of Cloten and bursts into indignity, yet fails to catch the real psychology of her mind. Imogen is not impatient of words, but of the importunate advances of Cloten. All women pretend seriousness and strict formality when they are not interested or when they do not want to make themselves cheap. Otherwise, they are most intolerable battles in the world. Shakespeare, with his usual irony, paints the affectations of womanhood. It is not true, as Raleigh says, Shakespeare's men as a class cannot compare with his women for practical genius. To say this is merely to dwarf the mind and art of Shakespeare. Women are never more practical than men. Of course, they are more matter of fact due to their want of vision. They are also extremely sentimental and extra imaginative. Men are thoughtful, calculating, prudent, and practical with a touch of imagination and sentiment. Raleigh says, with Lady Macbeth, all the details of consequence of the crime are accepted with the crime itself, and Macbeth, the murder is a single incident, is the moving history of human woe. She refuses to waste precious time by speculating on the strangeness of things, and he fails to control the activities of his mind and forgets the need of moment in the intellectual interest of his own sensations. If it is so, who did actually commit the murder and who did suffer the walking in sleep? Lady Macbeth's retrospective imagination disabled her. Her sentiments killed her in the long run, but Macbeth's prospective imagination made him more serious, more desperate, and more prophetic about his doom. His sentiment did not kill him, but saved his soul with lingering agonies of death. In the Shakespeare's women, there is no conflict of impulses, no mixture of motives, which led to complexity of character, and therefore they are mostly either good or bad. In King Lear, the characters of Goneril and Regan are very simple. They are wicked to the backbone. They are wicked to the backbone from the from the very beginning. And with all their evil designs, they are out-spirited by their own jealousy, malice, and hypocrisy. Cordelia is also equally simple. She is foolish, innocent, and loving. There are many women in the world like her who never think before unlocking their hearts, who can never imagine that truth does not always prevail, and who know only to confess, suffer, and weep all their life. Women by nature are instinctive, and Shakespeare also has presented them as such. He has shown how their wit and humor, their courage and love, hatred, nobleness, malice, jealousy, and even their smiles and tears are the fruits of instinct. Some critics believe that Shakespeare's heroines have got more freedom and thought, more of deliberate forwardness, more of personality and rational character, which other women lack. It is the true only so far as women are also rational creatures. They also have their will like men's, but in a much weaker form that cannot stand till the last when instinct relieves her from the conflict. Even Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, Portia, and others are not very much under the domination of their will. Their courage also fails, their heart breaks when the moment comes for screwing it up to the sticking place. And due to this want of will, there is confidence, a tranquility, a peaceful calm in their hearts, where is never disturbed by the storms of the mind, even in the most psychological moments. There is either complete nervous prostration or perfect equilibrium whenever there is any occasion for conflict. That is why none of Ophelia, Desdemona, and Cordelia can compare with Hamlet, Jacques, or Byron. There is always an indecision. There is always an indecision, a wavering of the will about Shakespeare's men, and particularly the heroes who are not creatures of fate as the women are, who are not made by opportunity or chance, circumstance, and that is why their behavior cannot be predicted with so much certainty as in the case of women. Mrs. Jameson rightly says, through the whole of the dialogue appropriated to Desdemona, there is not one general observation. Words are with her vehicle of sentiment and never of reflection. The behavior of Shakespeare's women is nothing but an impulsive response to the need of the moment. We notice it particularly in the character of Lady Macbeth, who acts only on failure, courage of nervousness, cruel temper, or motherly tenderness. This makes the character of all women comparatively simple for purpose of analysis and generalization. Some critics have remarked that Shakespeare's women are mostly timid, pretty, shy, impulsive, and without any independent personality of their own. It is true to some extent. It is not true also of life that women are mostly sentimental, mostly instinctive, slow, and hesitating only when the situation is weak, extremely passive, and unintruding unless some grave self-interest is at stake, with every determination to follow, but never to let for want of judgment and foresight, nervous at a crisis nervous and that crisis, desperately bold in the beginning, inhumanly cruel, malicious, and when once initiated to evil, but the touch of good can make them equally sublime, and are not Goneril and Regan the most monstrous specimens of humanity, while Ophelia, Desdemona, and Cordelia, the sweetest dreams of womanhood. That is the handling of women characters in Shakespeare. Thank you.